We are very excited to welcome back our very own Dr. Theo Samore, who received his PhD from this department, as many of you know, in the spring. So we are intrigued and delighted to hear what he's been up to, since in the brief period since his departure, and also, hear how it fits into the research agenda we've enjoyed hearing about while he was here. So currently, Dr. Samore is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Otago in New Zealand, although he is often working remote and finds himself locally, so you can chase him down on the streets of LA if this work inspires you, which I hope it does. So without further ado, Dr. Samore, thank you.
Okay, well, I am really excited to be back here after many, many years of being in the back audience. It's fun to be up here and having a chance to share my research with all of you. So yeah, I'll just dive right in. So today I'm presenting results from a series of projects that I conducted for my dissertation that investigated traditionalism, religiosity, and pathogen avoidance in the context of COVID-19. So in the first project, I examined the relationship between traditional attitudes and pathogen avoidance, taking into account the effects of competing priorities. And then in the second project, I examined whether people reconcile different pathogen avoidance behaviors when they have competing epistemic rationales. So starting with this first topic, I conducted an empirical test of the theory that traditionalism and threat sensitivity are functionally linked. But first, before we dive into that theory, I'll define some terms. So I consider traditionalism to be an orientation toward endorsing and practicing values, beliefs, and norms that are considered to be both longstanding and important to cultural identity. But importantly, not all traditions are actually old. Many, such as the Scottish Chardons here, are much more recent than people kind of think them to be. But nevertheless, these kinds of traditions are culturally imagined as being the way that things have always been done. And compared to other types of norms, traditions may be easier to coordinate around for purposes of ritual, ethnic marking, or in-group cooperation. Traditionalism is also involved with other dimensions of individual difference. So, for example, traditionalism characterizes socially conservative political ideologies, and it also plays a large role in many religious belief systems. So in addition to traditionalism, the research I'm presenting today also considers the roles of social conservatism and religiosity. Okay, so I'll also be talking about threat sensitivity today. Oh, it's an alert. Okay. Here I'm just defining threat sensitivity as the tendency to perceive threats as being more likely in the world, and then accordingly taking more actions against them. And I'll mostly be focusing on threat sensitivity in the context of pathogen threats for my talk today. Okay, but why should we care about dimensions of individual difference, such as traditionalism or threat sensitivity, and their potential relationship? So I think that these questions provide insight into why people vary in the extent to which they embrace or rebel against their society's social norms. I think it also sheds light on why people respond so heterogeneously to widely distributed threats like COVID-19, or why people disagree about the likelihood of future threats. And I think these are important social phenomena. They play a role in shaping political dynamics, as well as the path-dependent trajectories of different kinds of threats that societies face. Okay, so a growing body of evidence suggests that traditionalism is associated with greater threat sensitivity, particularly in the domain of pathogen avoidance, as I mentioned earlier. So that is, more traditional people appear to perceive threats as more likely, and in turn practice more threat mitigating behaviors. And concordantly, threat sensitivity has also been linked to social conservatism and religiosity. But from a functional perspective, why would we expect traditionalism and threat sensitivity to be linked in the first place? So here I'll summarize some different, I guess, at least what I think of as plausible functional explanations for this relationship. So first, traditions could culturally evolve to instrumentally address recurrent threats in the local environment. So some commonly cited possibilities are traditions around food preparation that might minimize the risk of infection or toxicity. But alternatively, traditions may have general cooperative or coordinative benefits that buffer against the cost of threats broadly. As a result, there might be stable dispositions by which more threat-sensitive individuals are also more likely to embrace tradition. Or alternatively, people may facultatively upregulate their practice of traditions in the face of threats. Another possibility is that traditionalists who may place a greater emphasis on communitarianism may be more vulnerable to threats that destabilize that cooperative in-group, and thus more sensitive towards stress towards it. So of course, all of these possibilities are non-mutually exclusive, and unfortunately, I can't fully adjudicate between them with the present research, but I think it's useful to lay out some of these conceptual possibilities. And finally, while these dynamics might apply to many different domains of threat, pathogen threats in particular may be connected to traditionalism. So it could be that traditions may be kind of particularly instrumentally effective interventions against disease, and hence more culturally evolvable relative to solutions to other threats. And vulnerability to infectious diseases may be one of the principal trade-offs of the kind of increased communitarianism that's associated with traditionalism, and hence leading to greater disease vigilance among traditionalists. Consistent with both these possibilities, both traditions and threats entail potential costs in addition to some of the potential benefits that I described on the previous slide. So people may have competing priorities that clash with the desire or ability to respond to threats. So for example, the need for nourishment can clash with the motivation to avoid pathogens, such that hunger approximately lowers disgust sensitivity. So I'll break down some of the different costs and benefits that are associated with both traditionalism and threat sensitivity. For traditionalism, greater group cohesion and consensus may lead to greater cooperation and coordination, like I laid out previously. And this might be particularly beneficial in the face of threats and group competition. Further, traditionalists may be more likely to adopt instrumentally effective traditions. But there are also trade-offs. So traditionalists are less likely to benefit from innovation, creativity, and individual learning, and they may also adopt maladaptive traditions. Threat sensitivity also has costs and benefits. So increased threat sensitivity may lead individuals to be more likely to correctly identify and respond to real threats in their environment. But the trade-off is may also be more likely to incorrectly identify non-threats and respond unnecessarily. And of course, all threat-avoidant behaviors carry opportunity costs. So the precise payoffs of these different trade-offs will depend on the individual, the social dynamics, the local environment, et cetera. And threats don't exist in a vacuum. People have to balance competing priorities, some of which may conflict with their ability to engage in threat precautions. So given this background on threats and traditionalism, what are some of the best ways to test the putative connection between them? So I think prior research hasn't really taken into account how competing trade-offs can affect the relationship between traditionalism and threat avoidance. So for example, there's a large body of research that connects traditionalism and social conservatism with greater disgust sensitivity, using disgust scales similar to the one I'm showing here. However, self-reported disgust to hypothetical scenarios doesn't really reflect the complex trade-offs that people have to make in the real world. And further, these kinds of questions can be culturally parochial or not necessarily salient across diverse societies. So is there a better way to test the relationship between traditionalism and threat sensitivity in a more ecologically valid context? So the COVID-19 pandemic was a highly salient disease threat that elicited wide-ranging and real-world precautionary behaviors. And COVID precautions, such as decisions about social distancing, were inherently reflective of individuals' cost-benefit assessments of the trade-offs of engaging or not engaging in those precautions. And finally, of course, COVID-19 was global, meaning that people across many different cultures and contexts were facing similar decisions about these precautionary behaviors and their potential trade-offs. So it makes it possible to compare reactions across a diverse range of societies. So as a result, studying the relationship between traditionalism and threat sensitivity in the context of COVID-19, I think addresses some of the prior limitations, or some of the limitations in the prior literature. Okay, so the theory that I've presented would predict that more traditional and more socially conservative individuals should have taken the threat of COVID-19 more seriously and should have practiced greater precautionary behaviors as a result. And this could even be true for novel precautionary behaviors, such as mask wearing or social distancing, if greater threat sensitivity leads individuals to pursue, even kind of epistemically incompatible or epistemically diverse precautions. But of course, casual observation in the US suggests that it was in fact conservatives who seem to view the pandemic as less threatening than liberals, which is the opposite of what the theory I've presented would predict. So given this observation, what are the implications for this theory, linking traditionalism with threat sensitivity? And what could explain the disconnect between this prediction and the actual dynamics around COVID on the ground? So one possibility is that complex real-world trade-offs non-linearly affect the relationship between traditionalism and threats, and thus may account for some of the conservative backlash against COVID precautions in the US. So what are some of these potential trade-offs? So in the context of COVID-19, many people in the US and perhaps other parts of the world perceive trade-offs between public health precautions and their personal liberties, their ability to engage in collective gatherings, as well as clashes with the health of the economy. And perceptions of these trade-offs may have been influenced by other deeply held beliefs, as well as exposure to different kinds of information environments. So for example, socially conservative beliefs shape what kinds of political coalitions Americans join, and then membership in these coalitions in turn shapes the kinds of information environments and ideologies that people are exposed to. And these information environments in turn shape perceptions of trustworthiness of different public figures and social groups, which might have shaped people's perceptions of information about the COVID pandemic. Moreover, traditionalists may also adopt more economically conservative beliefs if their chosen political coalition encompasses both social and economic conservatism, and hence affecting perceptions of trade-offs between the economy and COVID precautions. So, taken in sum, traditionalism may have pulled people in different directions when it came to their perceptions of the costs and benefits of engaging in COVID precautions. And it could have resulted in a clash between the theory that I've presented, linking conservatism with threat responses to pandemics, with some of these competing priorities that I've described. But of course, perceptions of these trade-offs are going to vary as a function of the cultural environment. Political coalitions and their associated information environments are culturally particular. And many of the dynamics that I've just described may be particular to the US in particular. So therefore, an important question is to ask is whether conservative skepticism of COVID-19 was specific to the US or whether it generalized to different cultural contexts across the globe. And I think this answer has implications for the correctness and the generalizability of the theoretical perspective that I've laid out. Okay, so that leads me to the primary research questions that I wanted to answer with this project. So first, in the context of COVID-19, did traditionalism and social conservatism associate with threat mitigating practices against COVID? Second, were there complex real-world trade-offs or competing priorities that clashed with the relationship between traditionalism and threat responses? And finally, how did these relationships play out across different social contexts? So to try and answer these questions, I ran 2 studies. In study 1, I collected 2 samples of American adults on MTurk in May and July 2020 using a survey questionnaire. And then in study 2, I collected close to 8,000 adult participants in 27 countries using a mixture of different recruitment strategies between October 2020 and July 2021, and again using a survey-based questionnaire. Okay, so starting with study 1, like I said, participants completed a questionnaire where they self-reported their adherence to traditions, different political ideologies, their precautionary COVID behaviors, as well as their attitudes about various political figures, media sources, social groups, aspects of their information and ideological environment that might have clashed with COVID precautions. And then I used a bottom-up approach to identify whether any of these possible competing priorities indeed clashed with the traditionalism-threat relationship. Or I should say that I used a bottom-up approach in the first sample that I then tested to see if it replicated in the second sample. Okay, so for study 1, the specific research questions were first whether socially conservative and traditional attitudes would correlate with public health precautions among Americans early in the pandemic. And then second, whether there were any of these competing trade-offs or priorities. And then finally, I was interested in whether different political coalitions affected the relationship between traditionalism and precautions and the effects of these potentially clashing trade-offs. And I'll note that social conservatism and political party affiliation are correlated, but they're not isomorphic. So of course, Republicans are generally more socially conservative than Democrats in the US, but there's still a lot of variation within political parties. So there's socially conservative Democrats and relatively socially liberal Republicans. So I think it's useful to disentangle those, party identification from the underlying ideology that contributes to those different coalitions. But I think it's also relevant that different political parties may, in a kind of a path-dependent way, lead people into different kinds of information environments that lead to different perceptions of trade-offs between public health precautions and Okay, so now I'll describe how I measured some of these concepts of interest. So, of course, individuals took a wide variety of different kinds of COVID precautions, potentially including things like traditional cures, appeals to divine intervention, etc. But here I'm going to focus specifically on public health precautions. So that is precautions that were rooted in a scientifically justified public health approach to pathogen avoidance. And I'm focusing on these public health precautions because they're unlikely to be considered traditional behaviors across societies. If I looked at something like traditional cures or appeals to divine intervention, it of course wouldn't be very surprising if those things correlated with traditionalism. So while public health precautions may have been normative in many places, like hand washing, others were quite novel, like social distancing. So I was trying to assess whether traditionalism would correlate even with novel threat mitigating behaviors. So as a result, participants were asked a series of questions about how often they were doing things like washing their hands, acquiring prophylactics, wearing masks, engaging in social distancing, etc. Of course, like I mentioned, this data was collected in early 2020, so there were no vaccines, so there are no questions about vaccination. Okay, and then of course I was interested in participants' social conservatism and traditionalism. So, I forgot to mention that first. So, I asked participants about all these public health precautionary behaviors. I then averaged those into a composite for the analysis. I then created another composite of socially conservative and traditional attitudes, which comprised of questions about kind of the general tendency to endorse traditions broadly. So, like this first statement, and then also about specific policy issues in the U.S. that map onto social conservatism. So, questions about attitudes towards things like abortion and gay marriage. Okay, and then I asked participants about some of these potentially competing or clashing priorities that might have shaped the relationship between traditionalism and COVID precautions. So, like I said, I used a bottom-up approach in the first sample to identify whether any of these variables were acting in that way. So these were generated kind of just thinking about different possibilities that might have affected the relationship between traditionalism and threat avoidance. So participants were asking about their trust in scientists, their consumption of different media sources and political figures, and then other ideological beliefs, so things like their economic conservatism, social dominance orientation, and then lastly, I asked participants about their party affiliation. Okay, and then I just asked some questions, some basic demographic questions about age and education, and then some questions about COVID-19 related factors, so things like pre-existing health conditions, requirements to leave the home for work, etc. Okay, so I'll just briefly describe my analytical strategy. So first I use moderated linear regressions to assess whether socially conservative attitudes associated with COVID precautions among individuals from the different political identifications. There were some people who didn't slide into these three categories, like libertarians, green, et cetera, but it was a small part of the sample, so they were included here. Okay, then like I mentioned, I used a bottom-up approach to identify whether competing priorities suppress the relationship between socially conservative attitudes and COVID precautions, where suppression was operationalized as testing for mediation effects, where the indirect pathway between traditionalism and COVID precautions is negative, whereas the theory, at least that I have, predicts that the direct relationship between traditionalism and COVID precautions is positive. So hence, adjusting for the indirect pathway increases the magnitude of the direct relationship between traditionalism and COVID precautions. And then finally, I again use moderated linear regressions to reassess the direct relationship between traditionalism and COVID precautions, taking into account any suppressors that may be identified in this bottom-up approach. Okay, so coming back to the research questions, first I examined whether socially conservative and traditional attitudes would correlate with COVID precautions, and whether that relationship would vary as a function of political party. Okay, I'll orient you towards this graph. So first, there are density distributions for the socially conservative attitudes composite and the COVID-19 precautions composite, which are to the top and to the right of the plots. So you can see that, as you might expect, Republicans were on average more socially conservative than Democrats, and independents were intermediate. Democrats reported taking slightly more COVID precautions than Republicans or independents, but it wasn't a large difference. But okay, moving on to the main result. There was a positive correlation between socially conservative attitudes and COVID precautions, but only among Democrats, and not among Republicans or independents. So that is to say that more socially conservative Democrats at this point in time reported taking more COVID precautions than more socially liberal Democrats. So then I wanted to investigate whether any of these potentially clashing priorities were suppressing that relationship between social conservatism and COVID precautions among Republicans and independents, whether there were particular dynamics applying there that weren't applying among Democrats, and hence explaining this difference between Republicans, independents, and Democrats. So, like I mentioned, I used this bottom-up approach to look for suppressor variables, and in sample 1, and I identified 4 suppressors. So this was distrust in scientists regarding the COVID-19 pandemic, distrust in liberal and mainstream information sources, lower consumption of liberal media, and greater economic conservatism. And then all 4 of these suppression effects replicated in sample 2. So I wanted to think about the possible relationships between traditionalism, COVID precautions, and the effects of these suppressor variables vis-a-vis political coalitions using a directed acyclic graph, which I think illustrates at least one plausible set of relationships between these variables. So I'll walk you all through it. So again, my theory is predicting a direct positive relationship between socially conservative attitudes and COVID precautions. But traditionalism also influences people's perceptions of scientists, given that scientists are oftentimes associated with innovation and coalitions that are non-traditional. And then, of course, perceptions of scientists also shapes individuals' COVID precautions, specifically public health precautions, given that these were things that were recommended by scientists. Socially conservative attitudes also influences the kinds of political coalitions that people join. And that's also influenced by people's economic conservatism. Economic conservatism, sorry, I know this is a lot, but economic conservatism also has an effect on people's COVID precautions. Specifically, at least what I'm predicting here is that economic conservatism shapes perceptions of trade-offs between the economy and public health directives. But anyway, so both social conservatism and economic conservatism influence the kinds of political coalitions that people join. People are exposed to different information environments as a result of their political coalition. This was unmeasured in the study, the actual information environment itself. But then I did measure downstream some of the implications of these different information environments, where one's information environment is affecting one's trust in and consumption of different sources of information, which is also then influencing both perceptions of scientists and perceptions of COVID precautions. Okay, so if you take all of this into account and you want to estimate the direct relationship between social conservatism and COVID precautions, at least this DAG suggests that you should adjust for the effects of these four variables in white, which are the four suppressor variables that were identified. So what I did was then reassess the direct relationship between social conservatism and COVID precautions by taking into account the effects of these suppressors. Okay, so here's another result from a moderated linear regression. I forgot to mention in the last graph that this is derived from regressing COVID precautions on the interaction between political party and socially conservative attitudes. But here, adjusting for the effects of these four suppressor variables. So now, in contrast to the baseline effect, social conservatism and COVID precautions tend to positively correlate across Democrats, independents, and Republicans. So suggesting that there might be this underlying tendency for social conservatives to take COVID precautions more seriously or to take pathogen threats more seriously, but that this effect is being swamped out by some of the competing priorities that we identified. I will note that these are small effects. So these are unstandardized regression coefficients. So this is indicating that for example, for Democrats, a 0.69 unit increase in social conservatism, which was measured on a negative 1-to-1 scale. A 1 unit increase in social conservatism results in a 0.7 unit increase in COVID precautions, which was measured on a 1-to-7 scale. So these are pretty small effects. Okay, so in summary for the study one, contrary to the kind of popular intuition that conservatism uniformly negatively predicted COVID precautions in the US, social conservatism was in fact positively correlated with COVID precautions, but only among Democrats at baseline. Among Republicans and independents, lower trust in scientists, mainstream media, greater economic conservatism, etc., actually suppressed the relationship between social conservatism and COVID precautions. I think I've already described most of this. Accounting for the suppressors revealed a tendency for an underlying baseline relationship among Republicans and independents. And I should also note that the results that I presented were robust to the inclusion of covariates, including age, and the various measures of COVID-19 risk that I went over. And there's also limitations, of course. So this was, I only assessed this in one cultural context. But of course, these perceptions of competing trade-offs may be culturally parochial and context dependent. Also, Like I mentioned on the previous slide, these are small effect sizes, although decisions about COVID precautions are complex and multi-determined, so I'm not surprised that they're not big effects. But I think, summing it all up, these results suggest that all else equal, socially conservative Republicans who may have been otherwise inclined to take the pandemic less seriously, to take the pandemic more seriously, had these kind of perceptions of competing trade-offs that swamped that tendency. Okay. So like I mentioned, these effects that I found in the US might be parochial to the particular information and political environment in this country. And so different information environments, different perceptions of trade-offs could vary across different social contexts. So it's important to test the generalizability of these results in a wider range of societies. So that's just what I did. Like I mentioned, we collected data from adult participants in 27 countries looking at the same questions. Again, using the similar measures, participants self-reported their adherence to traditions, precautionary COVID-19 behaviors, and then their, attitudes towards perceived trade-offs between COVID precautions and some of these competing dynamics. I'll note that I only focused on traditionalism here and not on political orientation to be able to compare across the different cultures in the sample. So, the precise political issues that constitute socially conservative political ideologies varies in different countries. So I just asked participants, going back to that slide where I described some of the questions measuring traditionalism, just kind of their general endorsement of their own society's traditions writ large. Okay, so I had similar research questions, but here I'm really interested in the cross-cultural variability and the relationship between COVID precautions and traditionalism. Like I said, I measured public health precautions using the same measure as I did in the US. Here's, like I said, just measured kind of general traditionalism instead of political ideology. And then I also measured some of these competing trade-offs. And I'll note that these suppressors were not meant to be exhaustive across all cultural contexts. Rather, I took the relevant suppressor variables from the US study, added a few more that I thought were maybe more generalizable to different cultural contexts, but conceptually similar, and then tested whether they acted as suppressors. However, I don't really expect all of these dynamics to apply uniformly across all the countries in the sample. Rather, I wanted to test the generalizability of the US context to a more diverse array of societies. Okay, so again, I'll briefly describe my analytical strategy. So I used random effects meta-analyses to assess the relationship between traditionalism and public health precautions across the 27 study sites. I used mediation analysis in the pool sample to assess whether there were any of these suppressor effects. And then again, random effects meta-analyses to reassess that relationship between traditionalism and COVID precautions in light of any possible suppressors. And then finally, I used mixed linear regressions in a pool sample across all countries to test the relative effects of different categories of public health precautions. But I'll describe that in more detail later. Okay, so starting with this first research question, was there any baseline relationship between traditionalism and COVID precautions across the societies in the sample? Okay, so this is a forest plot showing the results of the random effects meta-analysis. So I'll kind of walk you through it. So you can see, this is just the zero order correlation between traditionalism and COVID precautions. You can see what that correlation was for each country in the sample. The bars represent the 95% confidence intervals. The size of the square for the point estimate corresponds to the weight of that society in the meta-analysis. And then at the bottom, this is the overall point estimate across all countries in the sample. Here it's it's a little bit different. So the width of the diamond corresponds to 95% confidence intervals. Right here, And then those dotted bars correspond to the 95% prediction intervals. So the confidence intervals do not include 0, but the prediction interval does. So what you can see is that across all the different countries in the sample, at a majority of countries, there was a positive and significant baseline correlation between traditionalism and public health precautions, but there was a lot of variability nevertheless, and there was a small correlation, averaging across all the different samples in the meta-analysis.
Yes.
Yeah, of course.
Maybe you'll get to this, but doesn't North America look like the outlier here?
Yeah, absolutely. So I will say that this study wasn't really intended to be able to test hypotheses that might explain cross-national variation. I think that's tricky to do, and these were not representative samples. So I my data can't really speak to particular patterns and these effects across different countries, but definitely it does seem noteworthy that the U.S. and Canada are comes there at the very end of the distribution of effects. Any other questions? I forgot to mention at the beginning, I'm happy to take clarifying questions during the talk. So, okay. Okay, here's another way to visualize that same relationship. The beans on this plot are individual data points from all the different participants in the study, and then these are just regression lines for all the different countries individually, and the light gray, and then the black regression line is the relationship in the entire sample, and then similarly for the density distributions, these are the gray dotted lines are the density distributions for the individual samples, and then the black is for the overall sample. Of course, you can't pick out any particular country in this plot. If you want to do that, you can look at the supplement for the paper. I'll have a link for at the end. But just this gives you a sense for some of the distribution of these measures across countries. Okay, so then I tested whether there were any of these clashing priorities across the different countries in the sample. So using this same method of identifying suppressors, using mediation analysis, I found that there were 5 variables that were suppressing the relationship between traditionalism and COVID precautions in a pooled sample across all study sites. So these were perceptions of trade-offs between public health precautions and personal liberties, the economy, and the ability to practice traditions, which is, I guess, is not too surprising, and then also lower trust in scientists and social dominance orientation. I'll note that, like I said, I wasn't expecting these suppressors to act consistently across all study sites. And indeed, if you look at each study site individually, these variables acted as suppressors at some societies, not others, suggesting that perceptions of these trade-offs did vary across different social contexts. But for now, I just wanted to, again, for the purposes of being able to compare across study sites, I wanted to keep things consistent by using the same adjustment set of suppressor variables. So I then reassessed the relationship between COVID precautions and traditionalism, taking into account the effects of these suppressors. This is a semi-partial correlation between public health precautions and traditionalism, so you can interpret this forest plot in exactly the same way. So compared to the zero-order relationship, there really wasn't a change in the overall meta-analyzed estimate. It was 0.19 at baseline, and then it's 0.2 taking into account the suppressor variables. But there's less variability in those effects across study sites when you take into account the suppressor variables. So the prediction intervals, again, those dotted lines around the diamond, are much narrower. They no longer overlap with 0. And I'm just going to check the number here. I didn't write it down. I forget the number of countries that had non-significant correlations at baseline, but there are more countries that have positive and significant correlations when you take into account the suppressor variables. And towards your question, Molly, it's interesting that the United States and Canada kind of change in their position. It's still a non-significant effect in Canada, but taking into account the suppressor variables in the U.S., there's now a very small but nevertheless positive correlation, which replicates, of course, the findings from every study. Okay, and then this last research question was exploratory, so I didn't pre-register this hypothesis, but it rather came out of examining the data. So I wanted to look at whether the relationship between traditionalism and COVID precautions was contingent on specific features of different precautions. So basically what I did was I conducted a factor analysis on the public health precaution items, and they did reliably load onto a single public health precautions factor, but you can also break them down into these two factors, one of which I call external facing precautions, which are things you basically do outside the home and interactions with other people. And then the other I call internal facing precautions, which is basically things that you do in private in anticipation of interacting with other people. Like I said, I didn't expect this factor structure a priori, so these are exploratory analyses. But I was interested in whether the relationship between public health precautions and traditionalism would vary as a function of this distinction between external facing and internal facing, where there might be fewer conflicts between internal facing precautions and traditionalism than with external facing precautions, where things like social distancing or avoiding interacting with people outside the home might directly contravene individuals' ability to engage in traditions. So these are the results of a linear mixed regression in the pool sample across all study sites, where I regressed public health precautions on the interaction between traditionalism and whether the public health precautions in question were external facing or internal facing. And so indeed, there is a stronger relationship, almost twice as strong, between internal facing precautions and traditionalism relative to the relationship between external facing precautions and traditionalism. Perhaps consistent with this, the presence of more of these competing trade-offs for external relative to internal facing precautions. Okay, so in summary, despite the fact that there are different political climates across these different countries, traditionalism tended to positively correlate with public health precautions across the study sites. However, there were trade-offs between competing priorities, some of these suppressor variables that was suppressing the relationship between precautions and traditionalism at some study sites. And then again, these results are robust to the inclusion of covariates, including age, and those COVID-19 related measures that I mentioned. So again, these are small effects. The correlations were about 0.2, but I think they provide support for the theory that traditionalism travels together with threat sensitivity, even in these kind of complex, diverse real-world situations. Okay, so I'll turn now to the second research topic, where I use the same data set from the previous cross-cultural project to investigate epistemic conflict between different kinds of precautionary behaviors. So, based on personal beliefs that shape the perceived efficacy of threat mitigating behaviors, people have to make decisions about what kinds of threat precautions to pursue. And religion and science are two meaning-making systems that provide epistemic rationales for various kinds of threat-related behaviors. But religion and science can also be perceived to epistemically clash. So what happens when people have to balance these potentially competing epistemic beliefs when they're responding to threats? So people might perceive epistemic conflict between religion and science, and thus only preferentially pursue either religious or scientific threat mitigating behaviors. Or alternatively, people may hedge their bets by pursuing epistemically diverse threat mitigating behaviors, regardless of whether they have religious or scientific rationales. So similarly to the first set of research questions, I think the COVID context is germane to investigating these questions. So in addition to the public health precautions that were rooted in science, people undertook COVID mitigating behaviors with a wide variety of different epistemic rationales. So religious epistemologies were likely quite important, and people engaged in religious precautions such as prayer or worship as a group in order to acquire divine protection against COVID-19. And given the possibility for epistemic clashes between religion and science, people may have viewed those precautions as mutually incompatible. On the other hand, like I mentioned, people may have hedged their bets and practiced epistemically diverse precautions. So like I said, this study was conducted using the same data set as the previous project. So I wanted to test whether scientifically and religiously based precautions were positively or negatively correlated across study sites. So scientifically rooted precautions were measured using the same public health precaution scale I talked about before. And then religious precautionary behaviors included questions about the frequency of engaging in prayer or collective worship to protect against COVID-19. In addition, I was interested in whether the relationship between public health precautions and religious precautions would depend on some of those specific trade-offs I investigated earlier between internal-facing and external-facing precautions. So again, that part of this project is exploratory. Okay, so I used a similar analytical strategy. I used random effects meta-analyses to assess the relationship between religious and public health precautions across the study sites. And then I used mixed linear regressions and the pooled sample to test the relative effects of these different categories of precautions to see whether the effect was contingent on specific trade-offs. Okay, so first, given the potentially conflicting epistemic rationales, did religious and public health COVID-19 precautions clash or accord during the pandemic? Again, this is another forest plot. Engaging in public health precautions and engaging in scientific and religious precautions were correlated, tended to be correlated across the different study sites in the sample. Again, it's a small effect. The 95% prediction intervals don't overlap with 0. So there's a decent amount of heterogeneity, but the effect is relatively consistent. It seems like despite the presence of epistemic conflict between religion and science, people were actually hedging their bets and at least tended to pursue both religious and scientific public health precautions. Okay, and then lastly, I investigated whether the relationship between religious and public health precautions was contingent on specific trade-offs between the external-facing and internal-facing public health precautions on the one hand, and then I also broke down religious precautions into individual religious behaviors like prayer and collective religious behaviors like group worship, with the idea being that collective religious precautions were more likely to clash with external-facing public health precautions relative to other combinations. So here are the results of the mixed linear regression. Actually, it's two mixed linear regressions looking at the correlation between public health precautions and religious precautions as a function of the different types of these two different precautions. So basically, as expected, individual religious precautions, so things like engaging in prayer, were more strongly correlated with I'm sorry, I misspoke. So individual religious precautions like prayer correlated with both internal-facing and external-facing public health precautions, given that there's probably less conflict between things that you do in the privacy of your home and then the kinds of public health precautions that people took. But there was negative or null relationships between collective religious precautions, so things like engaging in group worship, with the public health precautions. So this partly supported what we expected. We didn't think that there would be a conflict between internal-facing public health precautions and collective religious precautions, given that it's possible to both, wash your hands, etc., and also engage in collective worship. But these things seem to be traveling together for some reason, such that people who report taking more collective religious precautions seem not to be engaging in more public health precautions. Okay, so a summary of both research topics. So returning to some of these original research questions, I think these results are counterintuitive. So despite political trends, more traditional people tended to engage in more COVID precautions. However, there are perceptions of trade-offs between public health precautions and competing priorities. So it suggests that the relationship between traditionalism and public health precautions is contextual. It's not kind of a given, but rather it really depends on the kind of complex interactions in the real world. And finally, instead of conflict between religious and scientifically based precautions, the two tended to correlate together. So I think these results underscore the importance of testing the relationship between traditionalism and reactions to threat in complex real-world scenarios. And the actual relationship between threat and traditionalism is quite complex and nonlinear. Of course, these results are limited. So these were non-representative samples, both within study sites and then across study sites too. And like I mentioned, these were small effects. Okay, so I'll just briefly describe some future directions that I'm working on. So continuing this same line of research, I want to disentangle the relationship between threat and traditionalism across different domains to see to what extent does this relationship generalize to different kinds of threats, or is it really specific to particular kinds of threats, which I think will shed light on some of the functional pathways that I presented linking traditionalism with threat. And then I'm also interested in how that might be shaped by different kinds of cultural environments, by looking at different religious groups that vary in the extent to which they enforce orthodox practice, etc. And then for my postdoc, I'm currently part of this project, the evolutionary dynamics of religion, family size, and child success. And so the lead researchers on this project, Rich Sosis, John Shaver, Rebecca Sear, and Mary Schenk have collected data from these 5 field sites. And then I'm assessing whether more religious parents receive more alloparental support. So kind of continuing some of these investigations into the effects of religiosity and traditionalism, and whether and trying to adduce some of the putative benefits and cooperative benefits of engaging in traditional practice. So with that, I want to thank the Issachar Fund and the Templeton Religion Trust for their support while I conducted this research. There were a huge number of collaborators on this project who helped collect data at all those field sites. So I really want to thank them. And then of course I want to thank the UCLA Department of Anthropology for all the support while I got my PhD here, and it's really rewarding to be back to share all of this with you. And with that, thanks so much. You can find the papers or preprints for the research that I presented at the QR link, and I can't wait to take questions.